Somaya, it's so exciting to see your work here in the context of your family and your father's circle. I wanted to start off this evening by asking you a little bit about your relationship with your grandfather and also how you understand this title, The Soul of the Sphere, as well, what that means to you, how you understand that in relation to your grandfather's work.
Yeah, I think maybe a good place to start is to say the Solar Sphere, which was the exhibition I initially curated, came together kind of through helping my mum to look through my grandfather's studio after he passed away quite recently and seeing all his artwork and particularly drawings and paintings. And I had a very close relationship with him, as I think did all of my family, and I think it's quite interesting, all of us probably feel like such a strength in the relationship. He had time for everyone. And a big part of that was sort of learning that he started out as an artist and a painter, and he was very dedicated to that. And then he sort of met Buckminster Fuller, and it changed his whole outlook on what he was doing in his life. And from there, he kind of began working with geometry and like more sacred spiritual ways of making and shape and form. And I've lost my train of thought for you asked me. But yeah.
But in terms of your relationship with him as well.
So through that, I mean, my relationship was just very close, and I lived in London. I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house when I was growing up. And he used to take me to the British Museum and the V&A, and I'd sit in, he had this amazing studio at the end of the garden of my grandparents' house in Stockwell, and it was full of incense and books from floor to ceiling and geometric shapes. And as a child, we were allowed to go in there and we'd have sort of a geometry form and you'd colour it in. He also just was very pivotal for me kind of having an interest in art and being dyslexic, and he took a lot of time out to kind of encourage me with art to the point when I was like studying on my degree, and I felt like I had to reinforce the purpose of what I was making, because you're writing essays and sort of saying, and you don't really know because well, I didn't know, you know, I'm 19, it's sort of like I can say the grandest things in the world. And he sent me this essay written by Plato on kind of like the fifth, and that there was the first, the second, the third, and the fourth, and the fifth was made up of those four, and it wasn't tangible. So he just was very much there at every point of my life as a person, and like my formation of understanding and thinking about geometry, spirituality, different kind of ways of being in different people. And yeah, it's interesting. I went to the Tate on Tuesday, I think, and I saw, you know, this person and what looked like maybe their granddaughter, and it really hit me, and I thought that's how important he was. Yeah, and he was just fantastic. Always told me, if you want to paint, just don't stop, because he stopped painting as he got more into geometry.
So did he still have an active painting practice when you were growing up?
No, it was more heavily drawing, but he did, every time I was about to apply for a new form of education, sit me down in the studio and give me a kind of lesson on something. And he bought me all my like paints and told me about the paintbrushes I should use, and yeah.
So the works of his that we're seeing in this show,
yeah,
were they works that were kind of hanging around the house? Were they works that you grew up with that when you went to visit him?
Yeah, so there's a couple of my grandma, his wife Gail, and they were just in the house. And so familiar, I think, for all family and friends that went through. And also there's the print of Frank Bowling, who was a close friend of his, and that hung in the house, and that always caught my attention as a child. And then otherwise it was more kind of being with my mum and going through his studio, and we discovered a lot more works that I've never seen before. And it was clear that and I know he spoke of wanting to do something with it, and yeah, I think though he stopped painting and ended up becoming more geometry-based with his figurative work and drawings, it's such an interesting dialogue, sort of looking at someone starting out there and the interconnectedness of that, because I was recently reading Leonardo's biography and just talking to Bill and Isabel about this. You know, geometry was central to making paintings, and like Uccello's paintings in the National Gallery, and just, yeah, so his work was everywhere, and I see it in everything.
Yeah, I'd love to come back and talk a bit about the geometry in your how that has had an impact on your work. But Bill, I wondered if you could just contextualize for us a little bit this milieu that Somaya's exploring in the solar sphere of this group of people that studied under Bomberg and who they were and whether this, there was a sense that they were quite a radical group, though you've raised your eyebrows at me for saying that.
I always raise eyebrows. We were talking about, after the event, aren't we? We were talking about going back to not just your lifetime, but generations before that. And Bomberg is a sort of iceberg in this sort of situation. And here I can be rather rude about art historians, I think. They have to get fixed lines of how you advance and how art changes. And if you have a missing link, well, that's the thesis material. And if you're not obeying the instructions of your inner self, you again are in the wrong. Bomberg taught in a heated studio in South London immediately after the war. And for those who are broke, impoverished and ambitious, his class was good on that ground alone, warmth. But the people who famously profited from going there and being there were Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff, who in the show. It's become a kind of mythology, and I am very anti-mythologies because I think mythologies sort of obscure things. But Frank, who I, like Freud, I've got to know very well. I sit for him once a week, and I have done for 25 years now. Frank gets very riled up about people who keep writing to him about the Bomberg connection and so on, because it's wrong. It's not the way our lives go. The way lives go is that you remember tiny nuggets of information that a teacher gives you. I think all teachers hope to do nuggetry. And in the case of Bomberg, completely negatively, Frank remembers that Bomberg advised him that Ivan Hitchens was a lousy painter. And he called it Itchins because he thought he was sort of wet and unformulated and unpushing. And so what I think we're talking about this evening is basically a way in which people urge each other on in portraiture primarily. And portraiture, of course, isn't just heads and shoulders, it's the whole being as well. And what's fascinating about coming here and seeing these 3-in-1 shows, this sort of trinity of influences, is that these ideas only become clear after the event. And we're sort of mopping up, aren't we, after the creative moments of 20, 30, 40, 60, 70 years ago. And that's what's so nice about seeing fresh alignments. And I think that's entirely down to you, Somaya, that you've thought this one out.
Yeah, I thought it was particularly interesting seeing Frank Bowling next to Kossoff and Auerbach because, I hate to go back to Bomberg again.
Come on.
But apparently, theoretically, he had this great line, which was keep the paint moving. But it was really interesting seeing this exploration of the quality of paint as a substance and its fluidity and its stickiness and its solidity explored in very, very different ways, but with that pairing of Auerbach and Bowling, I thought.
Well, the great thing about that is that they all got their fingers dirty, and paint is malleable, and paint is a language, and paint is what painting is all about. And it's wrong to assume, I think, that themes carry the can. Actually, for all painters, the way the paint is handled is prime, basic prime, and it's what interests them about other painters. And it's a kind of professionalism which applies to, I suppose, all aspirations, isn't it? And so it's interesting here to see the great differences of attitude and approach. Freud and Auerbach, very close friends. Freud, not so keen on your grandfather.
Freud not
Why,
so.
I don't know.
I think my grandfather was the same.
I think it's mutual.
Yeah, I think so.
And Lucian would have come out with a kind of vinegarous little phrase which didn't sound much, and then it worked under the skin and got
Yeah.
famous. Auerbach, much more relaxed in a way, but actually even behind that, his way of carrying on was not geometric. It was always trying to get spontaneity captured, which is the thing that I suppose 50% of painters want to do. I try to do and I fail. And then do the monumental because that's more handy.
Yeah.
But the spiritual sphere of painting is, which is what really we're talking about, isn't it, this evening? The spiritual sphere is this ability to conjure things out of the stark simplicity of the palette. And great art and good art has always got this charge, which is that you've kept the freshness, you've kept it living beyond lifetimes, and then to your cellos and so on, you get some of this dark wood and the people gallivanting around chasing things, and it's magical. And the magic is as strong now as it ever was, possibly even stronger now because it's so rare and so special from centuries ago.
I'd really like to stick with that subject of the spiritual and of kind of geometry and sacred geometry, and come to you a little bit, Isabel, because you work particularly with works on paper, with drawing and printmaking. And how do we see this investigation of the spiritual, this investigation of geometry kind of coming through in the mid-century in British art?
Well, I mean, absolutely, as Somaya and Bill have both already mentioned, from the Renaissance onwards, you have this kind of deep intertwining of geometry and the sacred and painting and drawing, and you have Leonardo and you have that gorgeous photo of your grandfather kind of within that sort of circular tubing, and then you have Dürer's treatise on human proportion, again with a kind of spiritual aspect. But coming into the 20th century, we're looking at the work of Isabel Cahoon, for example. She is someone it was interesting again to hear about the kind of stages in your grandfather's career and the kind of being pulled in different directions by painting and drawing and geometry, because I think she was someone who had an interest in spirituality and in occult spirituality in particular from a very early age, and actually wrote texts about occult spiritualism kind of before she went to art school, and so they were very much always kind of her twin interests. But in terms of geometry, she was particularly interested in standing stones, so I think that was where the geometry came in, but there was often geometry behind the stones that then informed her drawings. But again, you also have the kind of surrealist automatic practices, which often included some kind of geometry as well, so both came together in that sense.
Yeah, and they came together obviously in the film that you have downstairs in your display as well, with the standing stones and the cathedrals and the cellular stuff going on. I'm also, I'd really like to know first off how your grandfather met Buckminster Fuller. Was it a chance encounter, or did he do a pilgrimage to go and meet him? Or
I see my mum over there, so she can correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe he went to a talk by Buckminster Fuller, and he showed him some of his work. You're conferring. What's the? Go on, Matthew.
Chipperfield, but I don't want to.
Chipperfield.
What I understand is Keith was my father, so I'm the son of Keith and the uncle of
Matthew.
That he was teaching anatomy to art students, and he used to use geometry, the underlying proportions, to sort of convey how to construct the geometry of the human form. And one of his students said, "Oh, you really should try and meet this gentleman, Buckminster Fuller. He's coming to America, he's staying or working in the American embassy, and you can book a one-to-one meeting, sort of open house." So he did, and that's how they first met. Keith just leapt on the opportunity, booked a one-to-one. They had just this amazing relationship started from that point.
It's just extraordinary because he had such an impact on although he's obviously known as a thinker and an experimental architect and a theorist, he had such an important relationship with so many artists. I mean, Ruth Asawa and Osamu Noguchi being two huge ones, of course.
I think it's really interesting as well because from my understanding, it seemed to totally change the kind of direction of what Keith ended up doing. So it was obviously a very pivotal meeting of someone and experience that was shared.
That's how extraordinary. I'd like to talk a little bit about art as autobiography. I'm waiting for Bill to stop flicking me on the arm. I'm in a dangerous chair here, actually.
Steady on.
But I'm also interested by the way that we see Keith's life through the works that we have on show downstairs, because they all seem to be quite intimate works as well, these paintings and drawings, and what we can see of his life through the works that you've chosen.
Yeah, they are very intimate, and they're almost all of family members, or there's one of the coast in Dorset of a beach that they first took my mum to, and her brother when they were younger, and then we continued to go to, and there's paintings of that beach, and yeah, it's I don't know, I think in a way I picked out the ones that spoke to me, or that I also thought illuminated on just the sensibility that I think you can see within his work. And as someone who stopped painting at quite a young age in comparison, I guess, to the other artists in the show, you know, we don't know exactly when he stopped painting or when the paintings were made, the last one. I think there's only one with a date on it, but, you know, it was definitely, I don't think, carried on past his 30s and a lot of them younger, so... Yeah.
So in a way, it's a snapshot of him in the 1950s, somewhat.
Yeah.
When we've got that fabulous, because the photograph is from the 50s, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah.
And there's a woman who owns a painting which I'm desperate to get back from
Yeah.
her that I found online. But it's just like it was that time, I guess, where you know, artists, it seemed like could leave their studios and that work is, you know, this is what we have of it, and I think also for me it was quite like an emotional thing putting together the show, because I did have such a strong connection to him, and also want to make him proud and be, you know, a good display of the works. But I think the works that are in the show all have a sensibility, and I admire them all for their painterliness and as Bill said, about malleability and light and structure, and just, I mean, I look at them and I think, what an incredible painter, and I imagine what it might be like if he had carried on painting, but there's so much that he carried on with that's also fantastic.
It's a form of painting in a way, isn't it? It's painting without the paint.
Yeah, exactly. Quite a skill.
There's a lot of these things go off in and out. People in their studios think about things constantly, and they waste their time sharpening pencils and stuff, but thinking all along, and it's the dedication to a scheme of things. Mm-hmm. I think surely your grandfather is a scheme of things.
Yeah. And
he's searching for... The geometric is clean on the whole. Freud, fairly clean, but his paint got everywhere. And Alva, well, that's painted sort of swept onto the floor. Yeah. The Telegraph, he recommends the Telegraph. It's the only full-size sheet newspaper. It's a great use to him.
Yeah.
And that's what the Telegraph is for, in his view. Artists are egomaniacs.
No, it's true. But in the same way you say paint all over Freud's studio and Albach's things on the floor, Keith's studio, in the same way of there being no paint, it was a thought process of stacks of tubes of paint and books.
Tubes of paint?
Yeah, and yeah. He would,
unused though?
No, used. I don't know. Maybe we've got it wrong and there's more paint.
There's not a secret room somewhere behind.
Yeah.
We have to dig up it. Yeah. No,
what does your studio look like then, by comparison to that?
I tend to err on the neater side, but there will be books open everywhere. And I just moved into a new studio, and it's everything's sort of being sorted out and in its place, but the only thing that's evidence is that books are kind of running from the bookshelf around to my desk.
Frank, every now and again he stomps up and down in the course of a 2-hour session, and then he'd go and get his favourite book or there's 2 or 3 favourite books, and one is of Picasso, Laid Heads. And he throw it on the floor and grunt. And it's not to copy from or take effect from, but it's to have that sort of nudge at your shoulder that you can't do better than that, you can't do better than that, you're not worth anything. So there's kind of terrible mental, and I'm sure you have the same mental torture of things not going right, and then sometimes you get from elsewhere, by surprise, by magic almost, it goes right. That's the Auerbach moment.
Yeah.
And you have to watch out for it, otherwise you lose it.
But I'm really fascinated by this phenomenon as well. And it was actually something I wanted to ask Somaya about too, which is the artists that make you want to really push yourself and get out of your comfort zone. Because you have this line that opens the exhibition, which is talking about how astonished you are by the fact that he's transforming so fast. And I think that question of what as an artist it really makes you pull your socks up. I mean, I know as a writer there are certain people I read and I'm like, oh my God, I've just been coasting. And I've really got to polish things up a bit. But it's always good to have those people that slightly frighten you.
It's the Puritan in you, it's conscience, isn't it? They pick your conscience, your visual confidence.
Yeah. Or
Writer's
linguistic, yeah.
No, it's true. I mean, to be honest, I was looking heavily at Freud before getting to curate an extended, obviously Freud was in the solar sphere, but to curate this show. And I've always been very fascinated by kind of artists who start in one place and evolve, and it's kind of so exciting to see. Like Freud really offers you so much in the early works that then go into so many different phases, and then at the National Gallery culminate towards the end of his life in these really, in my opinion, just masterpieces. Like, it's really to be able to kind of invoke and involve light and feeling and personality, as well as kind of the historical trajectory of paint and contemporaneity and just whatever you also want to paint, and do it so in a way that comes together. I mean, I really love, and I don't know, I guess I'll be honest, I think at the moment we live in an age of digital screens, and I think that's had an impact on painting and the way we look at imagery. And then you look at like Auerbach and Frank and Kossoff, and that there's this looking at things from life, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and just to kind of take such skill to paint people from life, or to paint anything from life, and also just, I guess that's my area of focus is people and figuration,
and also a painting surface that doesn't come across on the screen either.
Yeah.
That you really have to be.
And the
in front of.
eyes too. The expression in the face is so much of it's contained in the amount of white you're showing in the eye, isn't it? And Lucian was terribly good at that. The pernickety detail. He was fanatical almost about that, noticing things, and always thinking that life around him is what's real, and what's the challenge, and what's also got all the advice he needs.
Totally. Well, it's like you say, maybe Keith and Freud wouldn't have been on the same page of things, but what I personally see a lot in Freud's work is the human condition, and that is a big topic. But
you can say the human condition.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound silly.
No, and I think it's very, and that's what. When I wanted to paint people, that's what Keith sort of said to me, thinking about the human condition, perhaps, and that was something I relate, and,
Well, it's empathy in his case, I think it's empathy with the people he always liked to have people he could get on with. He couldn't bear people who were fidgeted or irresponsibly late.
Yeah.
Or indeed, sometimes go off to Barbados for a holiday.
Turning up to...
So, Mick Vajada could go and stew for that.
No, and it's also through reading your book, the dedication, and you must see with looking at drawings and different people and the history of one person's drawing, but I understand that towards the end of his life, the amount of time put into painting, just almost nothing else begins to matter, and what you can create from that is...
And his relationships with people basically were through painting on the whole, and that on the phone. Hello, William, how old am I now? He'd say. On we'd go. And in a way, those heads strike up sort of conversations or non-conversations, don't they? They chime off each other. Whichever order you put them in, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the extraordinary wealth of, not detail, but wealth of attention. You know? And I think it's very dangerous to have sort of too much in the way of theory of art, but it is curious, isn't it, that a painting has got to be true to what's around it. You can't really do things in a vacuum. Geometry stems from proportions, I suppose, doesn't it? You've got to have a rule book of some sort, or a discipline, or a way of passing your time. They've got far more affinities than might appear at first sight, I think.
Isabel, I mean, we've been talking a bit about, I guess, about this whole thing about being surrounded, by the. I mean, when we're in that Freud, we're very much seeing a kind of what he's looking at various points in his life, and then when we're in the other side, a lot of the Critchlow works are. There are two of them. It's quite weird saying that to you in an abstract way. They're undated, and I'm really interested about this distinction between works that were made for public display and works that were made for private study, and how you as a curator negotiate that and the display of works that were perhaps never meant to be seen, because it's a very intimate sector that you're dealing with if you're looking at works on paper.
Absolutely, and I mean, if you think about all of the Michelangelo drawings that are in the British Museum, you would be horrified to know that they were here and that anyone could come and look at them,
There is trade secrets, aren't
there? Yeah, exactly. They were your stock in trade, but also the fact that perhaps they were less than perfect. That was the kind of story in Vasari, that there was a huge bonfire by Michelangelo of his drawings towards the end of his life, so that nobody might know that he was less than perfect.
But don't you find, when looking at Michelangelo drawings, that it's the imperfect ones that actually are much more interesting?
Well, exactly.
And those terribly bloody polished ones with everything not perfect, presented to a cardinal as a sort of bribe.
Exactly. I think that is what is so interesting about drawings, that you have all the mistakes, all the corrections, the kind of...
They're not mistakes, they're just processes, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly, a process of refinement.
That reminds me of the glee I found once when coming to the British Museum, and there was a Rembrandt print, and there was a slightly too big out-of-place eye, and I was just like... because Rembrandt's perfect otherwise.
You'd spotted it, and Rembrandt spotted it himself too, hadn't he? So, ping across the centuries, it worked. And it's amazing that way things can be caught and kept and survive.
But so, I mean, is there stuff that you have and it's just there for kind of private study, or is there a merit to show? I mean, how do you negotiate what you can show and what's private and what's...
I mean, so everything in the collection is public, as it were.
We can handle them, can't we? Order them up.
Absolutely. So in the print and drawing study room, anyone can come and book an appointment and see anything that they'd like to see in the collection, because it belongs to the public. But there is definitely that tension in that I think a lot of artists do consider their drawings to be, the kind of most private, secret things. And I think, artists like Louise Bourgeois, who referred to her drawings as her kind of unconscious, I think there is that kind of almost confessional quality often to an artist's drawings. But at the same time, I mean, you also, as you were saying, you have at the other end of the spectrum the very finished drawings, the kind of presentation drawings. And I think, for example, with Freud, you again have that whole sort of spectrum. You have in the exhibition that beautiful Narcissus, is a perfect finished work of art.
But you can tell with the 2 or 3 paintings there were done because he was absolutely, it's not just broke, but dangerously broke. And he did them because he had to, and you can tell the difference. Whereas Mother comes off track very well, doesn't she?
Yeah.
And she is one of his great inventions, the great inventions, that in the history of art there hasn't been someone's mother dealt with in this extraordinary way over a decade, well over a decade. And this is possible in the 21st century. I mean, it's a striking thing about art, taking you out of time capsules into permanence.
It's probably a bit off message, but I feel like I have to ask you about, because we are talking about your work and Freud's work, about female sexuality and this kind of idea of sexual agency and the relationship between the figure and the viewer. In your, because your work is, you've got this very direct gaze always, and there is this sense of kind of quite an equal assertion of power between the figure and the works and the person looking, whereas in Freud there's quite often quite a different power dynamic, particularly with his naked women, and a sense possibly of some kind of games. Men too. Okay, yeah. Fair enough.
And not whippets. Whippets
not whippets. Whippets can pee wherever they want. Yeah, of course. Could you talk to me a little bit about, or to us a little bit about the way that you see kind of sexual agency and female power in your works, and the way that you're thinking about the relationship with the figure?
Yeah, it's interesting because I almost feel, my honest opinion is I don't have a, I feel like I get told off for saying it, but I don't have a problem with Freud's depictions of women personally, for whatever reason, in how I relate to the artworks. In my own work, I guess I studied art at a time where there was a big conversation around historically how the female nude is a very iconic part of art history. And when I was studying, I felt, you had in America, when everything changed and lots of different, and abstract expressionism began, and lots of different new forms of art were birthed, and there was a lot of, the first wave feminism, second wave feminism, and thinking about art history and how people portrayed the female nude. And I began to feel as though it became a topic that was off limits, even being a woman with a body, that you couldn't even go there because it was some sort of discredit because of how impactful that part of art history has been. And I just think it's such a fascinating area. I studied quite traditionally, to some extent, in the life room, working from life models and working from nude bodies. And it's a personal fascination because I always found it hard to identify with certain waves and ideas of how you should portray sexuality and what extent of sexuality women may or may not feel, and if it was in opposition to a masculine view of sexuality, and how can we even possibly know? It's such a kind of complicated, layered thing. We all are sexual beings and we all have bodies, and it can be neutral, it can be charged, and I think also being a black woman, there's so many areas of art history which you are not part of in the Western sphere. Just to have I just wanted access to what's familiar to me, and also, I wrote about Walter Sickert for that exhibition at the Tate, and he wrote a really great essay called The Naked and the Nude, talking about how the idea of a nude had become synonymous with the over-idealized female figuration, and that wasn't actually a portrayal of nakedness, that had become its own symbolic thing. And I wonder if that's my own intrigue as well, looking at the nude in art history. And I don't know, and when you make artwork, you're thinking, or when I make artwork, I'm thinking, what do I make it about? What am I allowed to make it about? Should I have to think about what I'm allowed to make it about, or should I just, I don't know.
See what comes.
Yeah, exactly. And it was an area that definitely fascinated me, and there are very practical things as well, which I think is evident in Freud's work. Painting and drawing of flesh is totally different to clothes. Clothes are reminiscent of a time, a period, associations with that. They're also more boring to paint and draw at times, and flesh is sort of translucent, and you look at your own hand and there's hundreds of colours in it, and
and we've all got a body, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly.
But before, when we were sitting downstairs, we were talking a little bit about this power dynamic between Freud and his sitters, and you were saying there was a kind of wit and a gameplay going on there as well.
Yes, the people he painted, he had to be able to sort of correspond with him on some level of not getting on his nerves over the months. Whether he got on their nerves, of course, also comes into it. So they had to be compatible to some extent. And some barkingly, almost deranged people at times, male and female alike, were the most difficult ones that he had to deal with. And sometimes he gave up because he got exasperated and it turned into sort of petulance, and that was no good for painting. I think, looking at his work in general, and we've had this rather a surfeit in this country of Freud as 100 in the last few months, but looking through the various shows, what's so striking is, I think, that the matter of nudity sort of just disappears entirely after a while. It's our skin, our bodies, our most precious possessions, aren't they? And in Freud show after Freud show after Freud show, the success or failure of the paintings was entirely to do with the way in which life is reinforced by the procedures of painting. I think it's much more to do with procedures and than infringing boundaries of good taste or good manners or good behaviour or decency or all these other sort of emotive, Daily Mailish slightly ways of looking at things. Is that clear? No, not really.
Yeah, I think I was. I mean, because we've both sat for artists, and
Yes.
And I think I've probably sat nude more than you have for artists. But I don't know. Maybe I'm imposing this.
My body's disgusting.
But you know, it's a distinct relationship. And I've certainly, you know, having spoken to people who've sat for Freud or laid down for Freud naked, it's not always a particularly comfortable relationship.
No, absolutely.
And sometimes he really did play power games with people, I think.
Yes, and stated as fact. I mean, so what? I mean, really, I'm not talking about condoning terrible things, because we're not talking about terrible things. We're talking about a randy old man most of the time, and that's deplorable, but not out of all proportion, because there was a degree of
Reciprocity.
To these things, and they're more complicated than ostensibly looks clear. But just to be rather cheap, I'd say I don't like Eric Gill for his revealed practices. They stain the rest of it. Freud isn't in that category at all, as far as I know, and I really don't think that he can be condemned on that spot. We've all got our bodies, and the shape of our bodies is fascinating and depressing in some people's cases. In my case, the depression of looking at my kneecaps is...
At least you can still see them.
Yes, but with the glasses off, I mean, oh dear. You probably wouldn't understand, you see.
Just with my glass on the table.
It's these moot points are exactly what artists should be fearless about dealing with, I think. And that's not being evasive. It's saying that they're full-blooded human beings. And we were talking about Nigel Farage as a schoolboy.
That's quite the segue.
I'm just trying to kill things. So anybody in the audience is roused.
Yeah, it has Farage has a distinct contraceptive effect. Yeah.
Jeremy Della was at the same school as him, and is one of the most brilliant artists going, I think, at this time. You don't really have to do anything to Nigel Farage except identify that he's wrong, I think. And with painting, it's almost the same thing on a perhaps higher plane. And I can't really think of an artist, a good artist, a good soul artist who's not got things to be admired for and praised for and loved indeed.
Yeah, I guess I was just interested in the position that put you in as a viewer of the artworks, because you're then standing with that viewpoint as well. But I can see time is moving on, so I just wanted to end up by talking briefly to Isabel about, I think, one of the underlying themes of this show and also some of the works in the show, which is this circularity of art making and looking at art and generations looking at the art that's come before them and learning from it and drawing it, and how that is present in your collection in the British Museum.
Absolutely. I mean, the prints and drawings collection is an incredible resource for artists and for art students. And in fact, my first job in the prints and drawings collection was to get art students, like students at the Royal Drawing School, into the study room to look at prints and drawings, which was a programme funded by Bridget Riley, who had herself come in as a student when she was at Goldsmiths to look at Cézanne's, to look at Seurat's, and yeah, this kind of feedback loop, I guess, is something that continues, and was one of the first things that really interested me about Somaya's work as well. That there was this really strong sense of tradition, and you could really tell the kind of the kinds of paintings that you're interested in looking at. And I mean, then you have Freud and Kossoff, being given the keys to the National Gallery, and we have some gorgeous Auerbach drawings that he made after Rubens in the National Gallery in the collection. So yeah, you could follow these wonderful kind
It's
of...
the torch passed on and passed on.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of very tortuous family trees with all of these connections.
Did you go to Windsor?
I did. Actually, as you were talking about it, it reminded me how great there was a Holbein and there was a Da Vinci of a baby in a womb, and I sat and I drew it, and I was like going to push people out the way to get to sit in front of that.
And it's a Jura Whippet.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a wonderful privilege we had of going to the Royal Collection every year and draw with a Leonardo 2 inches from your nose, defenceless to be looked at, and the thrill was always there, wasn't it?
Yeah. I know, it's quite funny because it was like, we're going to Windsor Castle, and we're like, what's all that to be like? And then you get there in the drawings, and as you're saying, it was just like to know that. And I remember Keith, I asked him a question once about his methodology with painting, because I had this awful thing happen where I switched to different paints, and I painted a painting, and the colour sank, and it was the first time it happened to me, and that's when the sort of oiliness kind of goes dry, and the whole painting changed, and I was like, oh my god, I spent hours on this, what the hell's happened? And so I asked him how he used paint and certain things, and he told me I had to figure it out myself in a way, and that when he was younger he'd gone to I think the National Gallery have a library, and he'd taken out Turner's sketchbooks and read through his notes as a way to try and figure some stuff out. And so I think, as you're saying, those resources of, and I found when I was studying, we didn't really, we're taught lots and looking, and actually to go and look at artwork that's been made, there's so much in it that you just, I don't know, it's just an endless resource. I went around galleries yesterday and I was just like, oh, there's any question you have, you can look for the answer.
And if it didn't have that, it's how pointless art would be and how much diminished lives would be, wouldn't it?
And I think it was Freud who said that he used to go to the National Gallery rather like going to the doctor.
And he loved going to the doctor too.
Thank you so much. Well, it's such a fantastic tribute to this great tradition of looking back to the work of earlier generations, and this ongoing building on layers and layers and layers of tradition and influence. Thank you all so much. I think we've got time for some questions if people have anything they'd like to ask any of our wonderful panel. We have a question here. Do we have a roving microphone?
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating listening in to all of you. I wanted to ask a question. A lot of the discussion has been about the art and the context, and the relationships and the history and so forth. How important is it also, do you think, to be able to just walk into a room not knowing anything about art and just to look at an image or a sculpture or something and just sort of absorb it and decide whether you like it or not, or whether it's great for you? Because lots of people don't know anything about the sort of encyclopedic knowledge that you all have, but they can, I assume, still appreciate an image. Any observations on that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be able to do that, and I think that's a big part, in a way, of just going and connecting. And I'm not a massive fan, actually, of reading wall text, and so a lot of the time, I would advise going in and looking first, and then reading the wall text, because actually, when you look, you'll see your own personal, whatever you connect with. And I think that's the beauty of art. One person can see something in a painting that someone else doesn't, and that doesn't matter if you know art history or you do. It's just going and being present with something tangible and physical that someone made. And I think that's accessible to everyone, just sometimes people feel like it's not. But when you go in, I have friends who maybe art's not their first thing, and sometimes I drag them to an exhibition, and you just can see someone having like a wonderful time. And even the people who end up getting a bit bored or quicker than you might think, I still have great conversations about, that work has made me, So I think it's really important. You don't need the art history. It's enriching if you want it, and it's there for the people that it makes sense for. It's always open.
Do we have another question?
I just wanted to tell us, Somaya, if you just tell us a bit about your selection of the works. I mean, there's an extraordinary range, obviously, Freud drawings and other artists. And then also how you put your own work in and how you selected that as well.
I was, that's a good point. To be honest, quite anxious about putting my own work in it. It's a bit strange, but the show just came together so organically, thinking about the way of connecting it through Keith and these relationships, and talking about art through time and the historical trajectory. And I think sort of perhaps the interesting thing for me, not to be too like on the nose about it, but being a young black woman and having an interest in the side of art and these works and why they interest me, I think was the comfort in selecting the works and putting it together. And the works, I guess, are meant to hold some sort of thread of connection between the intimacy and the personal relationships, and in a way, as the question before, could relate to anyone, because we all have friends, family, places that we love. And I don't know, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I think we've got time just for two more, so if you're sitting there going, shall I ask, shall I not, shall I not? It's your moment.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on Kathy Colwitz's work and your interest in her work, the impact that if she has had an impact on your work, on paper and everything.
No, that's true, actually. And in selecting the work, Kathy Colwitz is influenced because Keith showed me her work, and again, thinking about art history or what you look at and how you look at things. Kathy Colwitz is an amazing draftsman, woman, whatever the right term would be now, but and in that same way, so personal. I don't know if everyone knows her work, but she made a lot of self-portraits. The way you look at Rembrandt's self-portraits, Kathy Colwitz's self-portraits are just incredible, and also very personal to like her husband and son. I believe both passing away in the war, and this mother and child relationship. And I guess because Keith showed me her work, and I'm just fascinated in the technical side of art and drawing and painting, and I just think Kathy Colwitz is mind-blowing. And a bit like you were talking about earlier, we were talking about in the talk, private drawings or works. Kathy Colwitz was just in a show at the Royal Academy, making modernism, and there are these drawings of her and her lover, and they are so private and so intimate, and there's no way she would have shared them with anyone, but you know, I'm happy I got to see them. So, and in the same way, like all the artists in the show evoke such a strong sense of something Cole's. She needed to be there.
And I guess
Keith loved her.
And I guess when I was talking to you about kind of sexual agency and the female body, I was thinking a bit about those works in the Making Modernism show, because they're really extraordinary for their for just depicting female desire. And you talk about the things that are unpictured in art history, and that's very much it's a subject that's much less explored, much less visible. And it still feels quite radical, as you say, to be doing something like that today as well.
It's true, and you talk about like timelessness. That's an emotion and a sensation that all people have experienced throughout time and will continue to experience. And it's not often seen, but there it is, however many years ago. And I mean, those drawings are incredible, as are all her works. There's a merging of people and life and skill.
We've got 1 minute left if there's a quick question. Got one here.
This is perhaps an unfair question, but could each of you say which is your favourite work in the show?
I'll go last.
The present company accepted.
I was going to say, it's got to be Somaya's work, obviously.
Yes, I flush with Royal Drawing School pride. So okay, that's enough being slimy. I think the Freud, one of the ones of his mother, is, in my mind, quite extraordinary. It's about this size, and she was quite a redoubtable old lady when I knew her, and Lucian was a little boy. This scold was a little boy with her, and it's all there in the painting, and besides that, it's a marvellous sort of human testament, I think.
I have mentioned it already, but I think I would have to go with the Freud Narcissus drawings. I think there was a lovely thing you said in your introduction to the show, or on one of the wall points, about how Freud wasn't always kind, but was often tender. And I think there is a real tenderness in that drawing. And again, that it's so distorted in so many ways, but you can tell from that distortion the aspects of the face that he's been looking at the longest, that he's been dwelling on. You can see those kind of acts of attention.
Which is a form of love, isn't it? And what are you choosing? Yes.
Oh, I have to say my favourite of Freud's kind of later career works are always the pictures of Lee Bowery, because I feel that he had a quite different relationship with him as a sitter, and I feel that it almost became a bit competitive, and his face never fell, and so he's the person that never looks depressed in the paintings. So I think, and I'm obviously a big Lee Bowery fan, so both because of Lee and because of Freud, I feel like I need to take Lee.
Did you see Lee in Mufti, in ordinary clothes?
Yes, I actually was in a double bill with him in Glasgow. I've been to a party with me. Yeah.
Yes, the Marks and Spencer wind cheater. That was almost another look, and it was his don't pick me out of the mob.
His grey wig. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But so I think
Happy days.
Yeah. So I think for that reason, not just because of the work, but because of the relationship it represents and the man itself, I think I'd go for Lee Bowery.
I think my favourite work would be that one at the back of my grandma, so the person in the blue, on all fours with the cutting pattern, and that painting is just, I think, from looking at it, of like how you set up a painting and also the love in it and just the way it's painted, it's my favourite.
I think that's us come to an end. Thank you so much, Somaya, Isabel and Bill. That was really, really fascinating, and congratulations on the show.
Thank you.